Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be going over a very sound opening, and that's the Semi Slav. You've seen it all levels of chess, especially at high levels of chess. And it starts with pawn to e4, pawn to d5, very common for high levels of chess. Pawn to c4, again this is the Queens Gambit in action, and then pawn to e6. Now again, opposed to the normal Slav defense where black actually tries to get his light square bishop out of the pawn chain, in the Semi-Slav he actually opts to bring his pawn to e6 first. Now white's going to continue with knight to c3, again simple development move from white, trying to control the center and get his minor pieces involved into the game. Black's going to play knight to f6, again same thing, simple development move, again trying to control these light squares, in particular this square here on e4. White's going to continue again with knight to f3, simple development, and black is going to play pawn to c6. So right away I want to take a look at a few things here from black. As you can see, it's going to be really hard for black anytime soon to get this light square bishop into the game. Obviously we do have this pawn structure here with this pawn on e6 blocking the way. More than likely, unless this pawn goes away as far as a exchange variation, then more than likely this bishop's going to be coming to b7 or a6, trying to get some counterplay, attacking the king side on these long diagonals. At the same notion, more than likely we're going to be bringing our knight to d7 from black. Anytime you bring your pawn to c6, that usually indicates that you're going to be bringing your knight to d7. What that also means is that you're going to be bringing your queen into the action, more times than not along this diagonal right here. Yeah, it's usually not going to be coming up, again because you will have your knight here on d7. So you may see, queen to c7, or you may want to be more active with queen to b6 or queen to a5, depending on the variation. Now if we look from white's perspective, white's really trying to control the center of the board. As you can see, black's trying to play kind of passive at the beginning, trying to get some counterplay later on into the game. White really has a few options. He can get his dark square bishop involved into the game. Obviously nothing right now is defending this pawn here on c4, so he could opt for an early e3, which is actually the main line. But if you look at this variation, you can also see that this dark square bishop is now locked in, so he does have to decide if he wants to go ahead and play e3, or if he wants to go ahead and get his dark square bishop out of the pawn chain before he wants to defend this pawn here on c4. So a lot going on just in the opening of the Semi-Slav, a lot to talk about during this video, so just want to kind of give you all some background before we kind of dive in to some of the main variations that you'll see. The main line typically continues with one of two things. It's either pawn to e3 or bishop down to g5. So first thing we're going to talk about is pawn to e3. Again, really opening up the door so this pawn here on c4 is defended. But as we can see, this bishop here on c1 is also going to have a much harder time to come out because this pawn here on e3 is blocking it. Now from here, black usually is going to continue, as we talked about before, with knight to d7. And then black has two different options. More than likely he's going to bring his bishop to d3, and then black is going to exchange his pawn here on c4, and then the bishop's going to take with his bishop here on c4. Obviously white wants to develop all his pieces, try to control the center of the board, and then castle on the king side. But as you can see here, once the bishop comes to d3, he's basically wasting a move after he does this variation right here. So a lot of times if a white player assumes that his opponent is going to take this pawn here on c4, he'll do kind of an in-between move and go ahead and try to develop one of his extra pieces. So instead of playing bishop to d3 first, he will play queen to c2. Now if white were to have his pawn leave on c4, now he can take with his bishop on c4, but he does also have this queen here on c2. Just one extra move closer to all his pieces being developed. Obviously he needs to get his dark square bishop involved into the game, and then white can castle on either the king side or the queen side. Now it is always very, very important that you understand the main line in any variation, just to make sure that if you're ever confused, it's typically a good notion to stick with the main line to make sure you don't fall for any traps. And the main line does continue with bishop to d3 as we talked about before. And after black captures on c4 and white recaptures on c4, now black is going to play pawn to b5. Again, one of the themes that you'll see in the Semi Slav is, yes, at the beginning black does play semi-passive, trying to develop all his pieces, trying to get ready to counterattack. But again, the theme that you'll see is you need to counterattack. If you just kind of stay back the entire game, white's going to pretty much dominate the center of the board, develop all his pieces, and then he's going to crush black. So you definitely need to have some counterplay. Typically in the Semi Slav, it's going to be on the queen side, at least in the main line variation. So it starts with pawn to b5. Now, white does have a few options here, but the typical one is going to be to bring it back to d3. This is the main line, and then black has two options from here. His first option, which has had a lot of success on the GM level, is to bring his pawn to a6, getting ready to thrust forward with his pawn to c5. Again, really trying to break up the center of the board. White really has a firm grasp on these dark squares on the center of the board. Obviously, he can't come right away and just play pawn to c5 because he does have his pawn here on b5 hanging. So he does kind of have this a6 move to kind of defend this pawn on b5, and then he's going to try to push forward with his pawn on c5. Obviously, he does have this knight here on d7, and he also has this bishop here on f8, both being a key defender on this c5 square. Now, black doesn't have to play a6 and then play this push to c5. He does have two other options. He could go ahead and bring, he could bring his bishop if he wanted to b7. He could also bring it to a6. More than likely you'll see it come to b7 here. So again, as we talked about before, since this e6 move was played early on, more than likely the light square bishop is not going to be played on this side, but again, we are going to play it on this b7 square. Black will later on try to thrust forward with his pawn to c5 and really open up this door so that this light square bishop can really get involved into the game. Another variation that you definitely want to be aware of, again, as we talked about before, from here, white usually plays bishop to d3, or if he is expecting this pawn to come here on c4 and capture, a lot of times you'll see that in-between move of queen to c2. Now there's this cat and mouse game. White really thinks that black's going to take on c4, so black can say, hey, actually I'm not going to take on c4. Instead, I'm going to play bishop to d6, again centralizing this dark square bishop, getting him involved into the game, and really trying to just develop our pieces so black can castle on the king side and really try for a counterattack. The problem with this is white actually has a very famous gambit that Kasparov used against Deep Jr. back in the early 2000s. I say that only because a lot of players, when they hear gambit, they automatically think, hey, this is just some dubious move, but this is actually a very, very solid move. And the move is actually pawn to g4, and if you look at it, it kind of looks funky, but what it does, if you can look at black's side right here, it's going to be really hard for black anytime in the near future to castle on the king side. Obviously, black can castle on the king side right away, but it's going to be very easy for black. Obviously, all he has to do, or excuse me, for white, all he has to do is move his bishop. He could just move his bishop to d2. He could castle on the queen side. And as you can see, if this pawn falls on g4, or even if the pawn comes on, c4 to take, it's going to be very hard. White can really push up the board here once black castles on the king side, and white castles on the queen side. He's going to be putting a lot of pressure on the king side of black. So it's going to be very hard for black to cope with this. Obviously, black would really like to castle on the queen side, but white just has too much under control, and black just doesn't have enough room to get all of his pieces into the action and castle on the queen side. So again, if you're playing this cat and mouse game and you do play, bishop to d6, or if you're white and you see this and you play this in-between move of queen to c2, and then your opponent plays bishop to d6, basically saying, hey, I'm not ready to take this pawn on c4, I'm going to kind of make you waste another move. Instead of playing anything fancy, just play this nice little gambit of pawn to g4. If it worked for Kasparov and it's good enough for him, I'm sure he's looked at it longer than any of us have. and so I say go ahead and knock it out because he was pretty good at chess. So definitely keep this in the back of your mind while you're playing the Semi Slav defense. Now, a lot of white players, when they do play against the Semi Slav defense, one of the things that they really have a hard time with is getting their dark bishop involved into the game. Obviously, a lot of times in the main line we see this pawn to e3, and then the rest of the game they just don't use their dark square bishop here from c1. Now again, as if you've seen any of my videos before, you know I always preach on the fact that it's not about the size of the army, it's about the size of the army that you have in the fight. So it doesn't matter if you are up in material, if you're not using all your guys, it really doesn't mean anything. So a lot of white players are actually advocating bringing the bishop down to g5, really getting the white the dark square bishop here on g5 active before the pawn chain solidifies here on e3. And he says, you know what, I will even trade off my bishop for the knight here on f6. It doesn't really matter. This knight here on f6 is going to be much more active than the dark square bishop than if it just stays back on c1 and it gets blocked off by e3. So this is kind of the reasoning. Obviously, these are the two main lines, this e3 and then the more and more popular, the bishop to g5. Now black does have a few variations from here that you will see. You may see it come into the Cambridge Springs defense, which a lot of players really like to play, and that is knight to d7, and then white can now play his pawn to e3 again, solidifying that pawn chain, and then from here black is going to play queen to a5. Again, this is the Cambridge Springs defense if you are familiar with it. Very solid from black. Now black also has a few other options. He could always play, you know, the orthodox defense. He could play h6 and just kind of see what white wants to do. He could always exchange here, and then he could bring his queen up to f6 here, or we could get some very, very complicated lines, and those really come from if black plays pawn takes on c4. As you can see right away, black is up in material, and from here black's going to really try to play pawn to b5 to solidify his extra pawn here on c4. From here, white's going to play e4. Again, this is very important to note. White gave up his pawn on c4, but what did he gain in return? He gained the center of the board. So he now has a pawn on e4, and he also has a pawn on d4, pretty much just dominating the center of the board. It's going to be very, very hard for black to cope with this right away. And as you can see, kind of the mainline variation from this, it just gets kind of crazy. I kind of like crazy, so hopefully you do too as well. But it continues with pawn to b5. Again, we really need to solidify this pawn here on c4 from black. We do have a small advantage right now, so if we don't hold on to that, since white does have center control, you never want to be down in material and be down in, you know, development and center control. But from here, white actually has some moves where he can gain back material. He can play pawn to e5. Obviously, right now, this knight is pinned down to the queen here on d8, so this knight is going to fall. Black does have the option. He can always come to h6, say, hey, if you're going to take my knight here on f6, I'm going to take your bishop here on g5. Bishop can be kicked back to h4. The pawn can now come to g5, basically saying, hey, I'm going to take you. And the knight can actually come in and sacrifice, and after we take the knight and the bishop comes back to g5, black's kind of in the same spot that he was before. As you can see, this is really getting kind of crazy. This knight is going to fall from this pawn here on e5. The king side from black is completely jacked up. But you can also see that white really doesn't have as strong of a center as he did before. It's going to just be wild and crazy lines from here. So if you come across this, yes, definitely if he plays, you know, bishop to g5, you can take this pawn on c4. Just be ready that, you know, right away white's really going to have control of the center of the board. Obviously, once he takes, you know, on f6, he's really only going to have this pawn here on d4, but it is definitely going to be a crazy game. So if you don't like crazy games, definitely don't take this pawn here on c4. Instead, go for something like the Cambridge Springs defense, as we talked about, or you could always go with the orthodox defense. But if you like crazy, hey, go for that as well. So the Semi Slav defense, hopefully you guys enjoy this video. Again, very, very solid defense from black. Many, many variations for you to equalize with your opponent and have very many attacking lines. Keep in mind that you do want to be aggressive, typically on the queen side. You don't want to stay back too much, and make sure that your lines, when you're playing, are on point and you have everything exactly playing as you should, or else your opponent is just going to completely run over you. So hopefully you guys enjoy the video. If you haven't checked out the website in a while, www.thechesswebsite.com. Leave some comments, let me know how it went, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.